I thought, how can I start a meeting without dates? Michael imported how many tons?
Well, it was supposed to be 1 ton.
Okay, and
And
how
then
many?
it was only 10 boxes.
Okay, and
Yeah.
how many did you intended to import?
It was 1 ton of
Okay, 1 ton.
dates, yeah.
1 ton of dates.
Yeah.
From Iraq. From Hela, right?
Yeah.
From Hela.
Kastawi.
It's not Iraqi, I'm afraid. I couldn't get Iraqi dates. Okay, that event, as we described before, it took about a year. Well, not about, to the day. The first time when I heard about Michael, and I have to admit I did not hear about Michael before, I heard when the sculpture was unveiled in Trafalgar Square. And I discovered that you have Iraqi Jewish roots, and I thought, ooh, that's interesting, I'm going to invite him to Iraq. So I asked a few friends about his telephone number, his email, and I sent him a WhatsApp message. On the 1st of April. And precisely at 21:55. Telling him briefly who I am and what is Al-Taraf. It took 3 minutes. Michael responded. This is how he responded. Dear Niran, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for the invitation. It sounds like an amazing forum, and I would deeply be honored to participate. So here's my response. Michael, the honor is all ours. And I'm really, really grateful that you accepted the invitation. And a year, it was well worth waiting. Okay, so go back. Michael has Iraqi roots, so I need to dig and try to find information about Michael. So I read his shop. We'll go into his shop. He's got a shop log. If anyone is interested, about 40 pages of daily happening in the shop. So I go and read it all, and here I am. I found a needle. Do you want to turn your chair so you can see? Okay, so that's Michael. That's your mom. And that's your grandmother.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's her father. And his father.
Wow.
And that's probably the name Shamoun came from. Yeah? Renee Shamoun was your grandmother, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Now, Simon or Shamoun had other siblings, right? And their father is Sheikh Sasson Ben Saleh, who was actually the Nasi of the Iraqi Jewish community in Baghdad.
He was the
Nasi, who was the head. He was born in 1750 in Baghdad, and he was the Sarraf Bashi, the chief banker, and held the honorary title of Sheikh.
wow.
In 1778, he became the Nasi. They describe it as a prince, but Nasi in Hebrew, it means a president, which was a position of great importance among the Jewish community, and one that he held for 38 years. Nice, right?
Beautiful. Wow.
We'll go on.
This is the farthest back anyone's gotten.
Well,
Well,
I have to tell you, when I started reading in your log, I went back to a family tree that I have. That's a family tree, which was published actually in the Scribe a few years ago. This is about the Sassoon family. Okay? So I dug some information. Now, Joseph, who is the grandson of Sheikh Sasson, had other siblings, Isaac and Eliyahu. Eliyahu had Sion, Saleh, Abraham, and Joseph. Joseph had 4 children, and one of them is Sasson. Sasson have 2 children. Benjamin, my son,
He's sitting over there.
Okay, so that's a surprise, right?
Wow.
That's when I read the log, I read Niazi, and
Yes.
it rang a bell. Niazi was in my wedding. So I
Ah.
thought, hold on a second, I have to go and dig the information. And that's it. So that's your family.
Wow. This is like, this is your life.
Your life, exactly.
And your DNA. It's amazing. I'm very moved. Thank you.
Okay. This is a picture that I picked up from your website. About, that's your grandfather, right?
In the three-piece suit, yeah.
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 That's Davison, right? Who opened the import-export.
Yes. Grandmother?
Yeah.
She's the biggest influence in my artistic practice, not
Okay.
just my childhood. But yes, my childhood, and I mean, she's the person who's transmitted everything to me. So yes, yeah.
Wow. What do you mean by artistic? What do
I
you
mean, she's the person who laid the foundations for me to regard things like cooking as sculpture and as a socially engaged art practice because of everything that cooking does. It makes a community. I mean, Michael Pollan, who wrote a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma in 2005, wrote that cities formed when people started to cook together. And when you think about masbouf, when you think about how long it takes to make that, and you think about all the people that gather, to drink arak and tabneza and everything while the masbouf is cooking, that's a city, and so the roots of it all my interest in cities and everything comes from her. So there wasn't any teacher in art school that was more important to her than me, more important to me than her. Yeah.
And how old were you when she passed away?
10.
Yes, and still with the 10 years old, she had a big influence on your life.
Yes, huge.
Okay. Did you speak Arabic with you?
She would speak Arabic when she didn't want me to understand anything. So she and my mother had this secret language, but I used to hear things like fidwa. And that's when I knew I was being good. And then there were other things that I heard when I knew I wasn't being good. This is something that I endeavor in my life to learn at some point is the Iraqi Arabic that the Jewish community spoke, which is a lot like Muslawi dialect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we'll go to your project. I mean, one of the projects that Dr. Ahmed touched, and he actually took my question. So, 2003 you started. Now, my question is, when did you start feeling that you're an Iraqi?
Well, okay, so there's a couple of different things that are confusing in all of this because I knew, I had Jewish friends growing up. Great Neck is where a lot of Iraqi Jews moved to on Long Island. My grandfather and my grandmother left Iraq with their children in 1946. I grew up in a household where I knew that the music was different. I knew that when they put on the reel-to-reel tapes during family weddings and gatherings and whatever, that it sounded different. It was eight-tonal, quarter tones and everything. And I knew that the food that I loved was different than the food that my Ashkenazi friends had. Their houses always smelled wrong.
Ashkenazi is the Jews from the Europe.
Yeah. So for me, all this Iraqi food, which would really come out in the fancy trays and everything on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and all these other holidays, I thought, oh, it's Jewish food, But then I started to realize, why don't my other friends' houses smell like Bahrat, And then it was during the Iran that Iraq started to show up in the news all the time, and it was like, oh, that's where grandma is from, you know? And then I remember at the time, he has a sidara, yeah. At the time that I was in grade school, there was only one other Iraqi Jewish kid in my class. His name was Niran. And we would play basketball against the Persian Jewish kids. And they would always beat us, and then we'd say, well, we're winning the war, you know? And it was like this weird disconnect, you know, like we didn't really know what we were saying. But then by the time that Iraq invaded Kuwait, and it was on every news station, it was on every headline, every newspaper, I was 16. And you start to think about who you are politically and in terms of what's important to you. I'm starting at that point to think about college, you know, and I'm thinking about what are the things that I want to bring with me from this place of childhood into adulthood. So when everything started to happen in 1991, and my mother made that statement about there being no Iraqi restaurants, I knew exactly what was at risk. And that, you know, caused a deeper dive for me into the family albums, into learning what those songs were, you know, to be able to say, oh yeah, I know, Chow Chow, you know, like, yeah, exactly. And I'm like starting to put it back together. And it was like fragments, right? And I started to realize that I wanted those fragments to fit with each other, and I wanted it to be something where the transmission of that culture was not going to end with my mother. And that it was going to be something that I could allow for that transmission to continue uninterrupted. And so that was the moment. It was that realization that, like, in my teenage years of who I was and not being embarrassed about it, and also fighting against it being dehumanized.
So my description as being an American Iraqi Jewish artist, was that okay? Was it the order okay?
It's totally fine. I don't, the order doesn't really matter to me. I mean, it's all in there.
Sure.
And I think that one thing that was very clear to me was that my grandparents identified as Iraqi, and they identified as being Arab. You know, they found themselves, you know, in this place where they connected with everything. They loved it, and they were brokenhearted when they had to leave. I mean, you know, this was something that, you know, I grew up, you know, one of the things that artists talk about in the realm of sculptures is this term called installation art. And installation art is like these rooms that you walk into where someone like Yayoi Kusama or somebody is like made this immersive environment that you walk into. And I love installation art, and I try to make it with my own work. But I think that my grandparents set up this installation of Iraq for us all to be raised in. And I'm very grateful for it. It was everything. It was the art on the walls. It was the carpets on the floor. It was the sounds that were coming out of, you know, the wedding bands, and the smells that were coming out of the kitchen that gets into your DNA. You know, they made it so that it was just normal for us to grow up around that. And I'm deeply appreciative for it, because they arrived at a time in the United States when I think it would have been a lot easier for them to get rid of all of it, you know, in order to try to fit in. And my mother carried it through, and she made it important for us, and now I'm raising a family. My son insists. Now, I married a Canadian from Montreal, a Jewish girl from Montreal, who's from like Lithuania, Poland, Russia. Yeah, my son, yeah. So my son, though, insists that he's 100% Iraqi.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's the Hara.
Exactly.
Okay, so Dr. Ahmed talked about this project, and it's continuous, right? It's still on.
Yeah, it's still continuous.
Okay, it's just pictures about this, and I wanted to ask you why the four stars, because it's interesting that you have the answer already. Okay, we go to one of the things I read in your website is you wanted to feel that the Americans are taking orders
from the Iraqis.
From Iraqis, and not as it was in Iraq, right?
Yes.
So yeah, so the Americans are serving, right? Okay.
And it's this whole other take on this notion of service, you know, because American soldiers are told that they're serving. And so many of the people that I've worked with in this project are American soldiers who have come back from Iraq and whose lives were destroyed by the war. I mean, this happens with anyone. And it's one of the things that's never spoken about because everyone is always more interested in who won and who didn't, and nobody ever really wins. You know, you end up with, you know, the children that we send over there, and it changes their lives forever. And so, so one of the people that I work with, this wonderful man who's in the middle with the cap, the baseball cap, his name is Aaron Hughes. And he's an American artist who I teach at Northwestern University and he applied to the graduate program where I teach. And he wanted to study with me. And he's a veteran, he came back in 2005. And he, you know, realized the traumas that he was dealing with, and so many of his comrades were dealing with. And he helped start the Chicago chapter of the Iraq Veterans Against the War. So during the time that America was still occupying Iraq and was still actively engaged in a war there, he was working to undo it, you know, finding ways to speak critically against it. And so the numbers of this group has grown. And so many of them, when I've worked with them, when we do these workshops where I teach them how to cook Iraqi food or we write together, and one of the things I ask them is, how did Iraq change you? And they said, do you know that question is really liberating? Because everybody's always asking us, how did the war change you? And if you put it in a way where it's like, how did Iraq change you? It's like, yes, how could you not be changed by being in this place that is so rich and with culture, and you're forced to do these things that you never wanted to do? That they all joined, they all enlisted for reasons that were not there. And so for them, this was a way of coming back and actually engaging with a community of Iraqis who have ended up in the U.S. because of that war. But it becomes a moment when something can be built together. And it's not just because, you know, I want the Americans to be talked to by the Iraqis. It's also about learning something. You know, and this very beautiful thing happens, like when we make a kebab on the skewer, you know, we have this Iraqi fist that makes the first impression on the lamb, and then the next fist is an Iraq War veteran, you know, and then it goes all the way up, and you end up with these castings, like a sculptural casting of the inside of your fist, and it's a hand that may have been holding a gun years before, but now it's holding a kebab, you know, and I'm very interested in what happens. We talked about the materiality of the monument and the melting down of the helmets. On the Enemy Kitchen food truck, the knives that we have now are made for us by Haidar Syed Musin, who was Saddam Hussein's personal sword maker. And he never wanted to be Saddam's personal sword maker. He was just a really great metal worker. And so I was able, through friends, to reach out to him. And so now when I cut the masgouf, you know, when I make the masgouf and everything, he's like designing the blades that he's like, oh, the American carp is harder than the Iraqi carp, that they have a harder head or stupider. So you have to cut it, you know, you need a harder blade or whatever. And it's like, it becomes this thing where you have this circulation, not only of people that were involved on both sides of the conflict, but also some of the materials as well. Yeah.
We'll go to the next project that you have, which is
your granddad shop.
Yes.
If you can just talk to us briefly about it. Yeah.
So my grandfather had an import-export company in Iraq called Davison's & Co. And when he left Iraq, he brought the business with him and he reopened it in New York. and he operated it up until 1963, and then he passed away in 1975. And so in 2004, I learned that sending a photograph from the United States to a place like Ramadi was like $80 because of the security risks that were involved. And so I started to think about what it would mean to import and export things from Iraq. And I found out that date syrup, which is labeled product of Lebanon, was actually product of Iraq. And that the date syrup was made, the dibis was made in Baghdad, and it was put into large plastic vats, and then driven over the border into Syria, where it got put into a can, and then it would be shipped to the rest of the world. And this was the way that the UN sanctions were circumvented. But this was like 2004, and I wondered why after mission accomplished and the lowering of the sanctions of the UN, why was this still happening? And they said that it was because of prohibitive security scans. If anything says it's product of Iraq, it gets charged or it gets turned away. And so I decided, okay, I have a $10,000 grant. I'm going to reopen my grandfather's company to do this crazy project that every other importer told me this is bad business. And I said, yeah, but it's good art. And so I decided to sign a contract to import 1 ton of Kastawi dates from Hilla in boxes that clearly said product of Iraq, because I wanted those dates to be proud, to say where they were from, not to be victims of xenophobia, you know? And the whole story ends up, you know, it tells the story of the Iraqi refugees, because tragically the dates, after they're picked from the tree, they get put into the boxes, they go into a truck, and then that truck is waiting in 2006 in a line of cars that's 4 days long, as Iraqis are trying to leave this sectarian violence, and then gets sent back because the Jordanians believed that there was radiation in the dates, and then it has to go again, and then it got refused. And by the time the dates appear in Syria, weeks and weeks later, it's found that they cooked in the truck. And they died, basically. The dates were not able to be imported anymore because they spoiled, basically. So the company ended up airlifting out 10 boxes of dates. Well, that's 1 ton of dates, yeah. But then they sent about 10 boxes. So this is 4 of the 10 boxes that they sent. And then that, though, took 1 month. It was in 1 month in quarantine at JFK Airport in the US because they thought it was a security risk. Yeah.
But you managed to make friends through this shop, right?
Yeah. There were many Iraqis who came in, but people from all the different communities and all the different countries. And it was located on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, which is the heart of New York City's Arab community. And so it became like this place that became a community hub as well.
You can see on the shop, it's written there, Huna.
Yeah, the shopkeepers were telling me that they thought that I was crazy for having the word Iraq printed on a glass window in the middle of the Iraq war.
Yeah, we'll go to the next project. Okay, that was all.
Oh, that's 2013 actually.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
2013. And that's the picture of your grandmother.
Yep. Yeah.
And if you can just tell us briefly about this, what is the aim of this?
So Dar al-Sad came out of an invitation from Aya Moussaoui and Simon Sakai, who were 2 curators that had this project called the Moving Museum. And Aya is from Iraq, or her family's from Iraq. She's based in London. And she told me they were doing a project in Dubai. And they asked me if I would consider doing Enemy Kitchen. And I said, well, Enemy Kitchen doesn't really have the same resonance in Dubai. It's, you know, there's already Iraqi restaurants in Dubai, and this friction, this tension is not there that we have in the United States. And I said, if you really want me to do a project that is about hospitality and hostility and friction, then I would open up the first Iraqi Jewish restaurant in the Arab world in over 80 years. And then they were crazy enough to say, yeah, let's do that, you know? And so Dar al-Sud was basically this restaurant, like a ghost that appeared in Dubai for 7 days, a whole week, where we cooked Iraqi food. And some of the, the recipes that are specific to the Jewish community. And so I had the serving trays from the great synagogue of Baghdad. I had the tabit tray that was used by the Muallim family. So it was a way of making people present there that couldn't be present. And it was, the experience was beautiful because there were all these moments of intersection and overlap where people understood, that as Syria was falling apart and as people from Syria ended up in places like the Emirates, that all of our dispossessions and our returns are entangled and intertwined. And we need to be there for each other in solidarity. And what you realize is, like, you could talk about a Babylonian exile, but which Babylonian exile, right? There's too many, right? And so there's all these moments of diaspora and dispossession and exile that is unfortunately the legacy of the Middle East. And to speak about it specifically is just one way of opening it up to everybody. And what I loved about the term Dar al-Sud was that it refers to the domain of conciliation, which is the agreement in the Arab world, the Muslim world, the Islamic world, that is about tolerance, and that is about mutual understanding. And I love this term, domain of conciliation, because it sounded like, Superman's fortress of solitude. It sounded like a space that needed to be made again and needed to be re-articulated. And I thought, well, what better way than opening up that restaurant my mother wanted to open up, right?
Yes. Now, whoever can't afford buying things of Michael's art, there are things that are sold probably in the British Museum or other museums.
Yeah,
you can get it online. I know you can get it online.
I think so.
And they're affordable.
I'm not seeing any proceeds from this. Just
okay. No, I know, but if anyone wants something of Michael's, it's affordable. The last thing is this masgoof idea. Now, what I love really in this is how the knife is holding and not a wooden stick.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us briefly about, you started fishing as well, right?
Yeah, I became a pretty good fisherman. One thing that I love about art is I get to learn something new each time. I get to take on a new craft. And so I started working with a champion fisherman in Chicago named Johnny Wilkins, who taught me how to catch carp. Because carp, I can't go into the full story, but carp in the United States is the fish that nobody wants to eat. And it's because people refer to it in this racial way. They call it a bottom feeder, but every fish feeds at all different levels of the water column. And they call it a bottom feeder not because the fish feeds from the bottom, but because the people who used to fish for carp were people like the African Americans, the Chinese immigrants, and the Jews. And so the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who were the upper class, would walk by the ponds where they had the carp, and they would refer to the people that are fishing for the carp as bottom feeders. And so it's considered an invasive species, and I wanted to do a project that was about food and refugees, and the refugees in the United States are referred to as invasive species. And so it was another way of collaborating with the Iraqi community, but this time we went on fishing trips, trying to catch this fish that everybody else was using for fertilizer. And so we did these fishing trips with the Iraq War veterans and Iraqi refugees. And the Iraqis who were in the army would bring their bayonets, and the Americans who were in the army would bring their bayonets, and they would use it as a way of holding up the fish next to the fire. And we made masgoof. I mean, it takes hours, and it is so rewarding to do because, I mean, it's the most incredible way for me to convene with my most ancient ancestors, you know, and to think that this is a dish that has survived since Babylonian times. And I grew up with my grandmother. My grandmother hated masgouf because she could never make it properly in New York. So it was never like getting it on Abu Noas Street, you know. So diaspora masgouf can be disappointing if you don't make it well. And so I always had to ask Iraqis, does it taste right, you know? And they would give me pointers like, this is not, the wood is wrong. You need to use apricot wood because that's what we use in Iraq. And so I would get apricot wood.
And you need to eat it by hand.
You eat it by hand, and that's the thing. Americans won't eat carp also because it's a bony fish.
Yes.
And so the fork is holding them back, you know, like damn modernity, you know? and so you have to eat it with your fingers, you have to eat it, you know, you can have it with amba, you can have it with tanur. But there's so many different ways of eating it. But like once I got the flavor of the fish right, I felt like,
wow,
you know, like I'd finally done something that I wasn't receiving when I was a kid, you know?
I finished my presentation here, but we haven't finished the evening yet. I would like to pause here and thank you again. And as usually, we present our guests with a small thing. So I've got my colleague. That's not yours.
No. I'm just trying it for the first time. Really, that shows it's the new Iraq.
The history of it.
The new history of Iraq. 100 years ago, when the first king came to Iraq in the 20s of last century, and he chose to wear this type of, you know, head cover, and it's become an Iraqi sidara. So I'm here proud to present it to you, Michael. You are really
printed some information about Sidara, so you can read it in your own time. Now the other thing is, I asked a friend of mine who just returned back from Baghdad to get me something from Michael. I said, I want something from Baghdad. I don't know, just do something. And I think he chose the best thing.
Wow, perfect. So we have the Lamasu and Baba Ishtar and the lion that's still in Babylon. Wow, thank you.
Dr. Ahmed told me, I put a picture next to the lion when I was little. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, and lastly is a certificate of appreciation. Now, we usually give it in Arabic, but I did the English as well, which is hidden behind here. This one is in Arabic, but behind it you've got the English.
Thank you so
And
much.
it says a certificate of appreciation. This is presented to Michael Rakowitz for participation in the forum event on the 2nd of April and for dedicating much of his work to Iraq, to its history, its culture, and its archaeology. Wishing him all the success in the future.
thank you all for coming.
And okay, that's a present
From our poet, Iraqi poet, Adnan Asai, who has left already. This is especially for Michael. And lastly, we're going to trouble now with Ahl Barakat to Iraq.
So this has been a fantastic opportunity. I'm greatly honoured to have been here this evening to have shared this experience. I think the opportunity for contemporary art and ancient heritage to come together to show how it can be a way of forging community spirit and identity. And it's been a terrific moment to have shared this with so many people.
الأمسية طبعا جميلة جدا، ومايكل المحتفى به أتحفنا بالكلام عن مشاريعه اللي سواها وعن علاقته بالعراق وعن علاقته بالأكل العراقي والتمر والعسل how he became a fisherman because he likes مزقوف، إضافة إلى أنه يعني فنان مبدع وجميل.
My name is Ayad Abdullahad. I was born in Baghdad. I've lived in outside Iraq for more than 40 years, and I'm a medical doctor. What brought me here really was the fourth plinth. I was fascinated, and when Niran told me that we'll have an evening with the artist, I've read a little about him, but this evening turned out to be quite an inspiration. It's really, the man is just, he's extraordinary in every way, as a great artist, as a great thinker, as a humanist, and he just, the way he presents what he does just goes right through your heart. It has been really a wonderful evening. It's really his ethos and his, his pride in his roots, and combining the old ancient Iraq with modern work, and also what comes through is his great sympathy and empathy with people, and his humanity, as I said.
Well, I am originally from Baghdad. I came to this hospitable country as a refugee with my family 35 years ago. I got involved with the community, and there is a lot of Iraqi living in UK, and I discovered my old roots where I born in Baghdad. It was a Jewish quarter called Batawin, and I found here a lot of Iraqi Jews in London, and I discovered that they are actually more Iraqis than anybody else, although they left Iraq much earlier, in the 50s and the 40s and even the 20s. Families used to send their children to study in London, and they settled, and because of the trouble always about what's happening in Iraq history, recent history, that everybody stayed out. Whoever reached the West, instead of studying and going back, they just sat here and settled. And the same with my family. My two children grew up here, and they are British, and but our roots is so strong. Actually, we left Iraq, but Iraq didn't leave us. It's in our heart, in our mind, sometimes in our dreams. So many times I wake up in the middle of the night dreaming about my old city, my old street in Baghdad and Batawin. And I used to play when I was a kid, I used to play with Christian, Jews, and other religion. We didn't know. I mean, we were just like one family. Just when we grow up, we notice that they are disappearing from around us. The Christian, the Jews, and a lot of Iraqis. Then even us, we left Iraq, as I said, but Iraq didn't leave us. I mean, his statue in Trafalgar Square made a lot of Iraqis so proud that actually this is part of our history and heritage. It's in London and is staying in the public, and people are interested, and they are going there and reading the detail, find out about the details of this statue, and it makes us so happy that somebody, apparently an American, but his origin is in Iraqi, and that shows that we, as most of Iraqis around the world, they can't leave Iraq, although they already left. And we feel so close when any event where arts, music, we gather like only as Iraqi, although we are from different races in Iraq, a different religion and different culture. Each city in Iraq have its own culture, but still when there's an Iraqi event, especially London, because there's a lot of Iraqis in London, we feel like one big family in that event.
Request for me now. We make it take away for you. لازم تغنون وياي. يا بسم. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Niran. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you. And as I usually end up every evening by wishing you تصبحون على العراق.